I never thought I'd be the type of person to have a horror story worth telling. I was just a regular college student at Northwestern University in Chicago, majoring in psychology, trying to make it through my junior year without completely losing my mind to stress and caffeine addiction. I was the kind of student who actually enjoyed studying, who found comfort in the quiet corners of the library, surrounded by books and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. The library was my sanctuary, my safe space where I could focus and actually get work done without the distractions of my noisy dorm room or the constant social pressure of the student union. It was October 2019, and I was deep into midterm season. Everyone knows that time of year when the campus transforms from a place of learning into a stress-filled battlefield where students wage war against impossible deadlines and overwhelming workloads. I had fallen into a routine that worked perfectly for my schedule and my personality. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I would make my way to the main library around 8 p.m. after the dinner rush had died down and most of the social butterflies had retreated to their evening activities. I'd claim my favorite spot on the fourth floor in the northeast corner where the psychology and sociology books lived, at a table that was perfectly positioned between two tall stacks that gave me privacy but still allowed me to see the main walkway. This particular routine had been working flawlessly for about 6 weeks. I knew exactly which vending machine had the best snacks, which restrooms were the cleanest, and which study areas stayed the quietest longest. I knew the security guard's patrol schedule, the cleaning crew's routine, and even which librarians worked the late shifts. The building felt like a second home to me, familiar and comfortable in a way that made me feel completely safe and in control of my environment. The first time I noticed him, it was a Tuesday night in mid-October. I had been working on a particularly challenging research paper about cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, completely absorbed in my work, when I felt that strange sensation you get when someone is watching you. You know the feeling, that prickly awareness that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, even when you can't see anyone around you. I looked up from my laptop screen and scanned the immediate area, but I didn't see anyone. The fourth floor was practically empty, which was normal for a Tuesday night. I shrugged it off and went back to my work, convincing myself it was just my imagination running wild from too much caffeine and too little sleep. But about 20 minutes later, I felt it again. This time, when I looked up, I caught a glimpse of someone disappearing behind the stacks about 30 feet away. It was just a shadow, really, a dark figure that moved quickly out of sight the moment I turned my head. I told myself it was probably just another student looking for a book, maybe someone who was just as focused on their studies as I was and didn't want to be disturbed. College libraries are full of people who prefer to study in solitude, so this didn't seem particularly unusual or concerning. I tried to refocus on my work, but something about the interaction felt off. Maybe it was the way the figure had moved, quick and almost furtive, like someone who didn't want to be seen. Or maybe it was the fact that I hadn't heard any footsteps or the sound of books being moved, which you'd expect if someone was actually looking for something specific. But I pushed these thoughts aside and forced myself to concentrate on my research. I had a deadline to meet, and I couldn't afford to let my imagination derail my productivity. The rest of that Tuesday night passed without incident. I packed up my things around 11 p.m., said goodnight to the security guard at the front desk, and walked back to my dorm room, feeling satisfied with the progress I'd made on my paper. By Wednesday morning, I had completely forgotten about the strange feeling of being watched. College life has a way of moving so fast that small, seemingly insignificant moments get swept away in the current of assignments, classes, and social obligations. Thursday night, I returned to my usual spot with my usual routine. I grabbed a coffee from the vending machine, settled into my favorite chair, and spread out my materials for a different project, This time, a statistics assignment that required absolute concentration and multiple hours of uninterrupted work. I was about an hour into my calculations when I felt it again. That unmistakable sensation of being observed, of being the subject of someone's focused attention. This time, I was more deliberate about my response. Instead of looking up quickly and obviously, I pretended to stretch and yawn, using the movement as an excuse to casually scan the area around me. That's when I saw him clearly for the first time. He was standing at the end of the aisle, about 40 feet away, partially hidden behind a tall shelf of books. He was average height, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair and what looked like a navy blue hoodie. What struck me most was how still he was standing and how he seemed to be looking directly at me. The moment our eyes met, even from that distance, he immediately turned and walked away. Not the casual movement of someone who had been browsing and happened to look in my direction, but the quick, deliberate movement of someone who had been caught doing something they shouldn't have been doing. My heart rate picked up slightly, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just another student who had been spacing out while thinking about his own work, and our accidental eye contact had snapped him back to reality. But as I tried to return to my statistics problems, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way he had been standing was too still, too focused. People who are casually browsing books move around, they pull books off shelves, they shift their weight from foot to foot. This person had been standing in one position, facing my direction, for long enough that I had been able to feel his attention before I even looked up. I decided to test my theory. I packed up my things and moved to a different table, one that was on the opposite side of the floor, but still within the same general study area. I made sure to choose a spot where I could see more of the surrounding area, where it would be harder for someone to watch me without being visible themselves. I settled in and pretended to be absorbed in my work, while actually staying alert to my surroundings. About 15 minutes later, I saw him again. This time, he was positioned differently, but once again, he seemed to be oriented toward my new location. He was pretending to look at books on a shelf, but his body language was all wrong. He was holding the same book for too long, not really reading it, and his posture was angled so that he could see me in his peripheral vision. When I shifted in my chair to get a better look at him, he immediately put the book back and walked away. Now I was genuinely concerned. This wasn't coincidence or imagination. Someone was deliberately watching me, and they were being careful about how they did it. They knew enough to move when I moved, to change their position when I changed mine, and to avoid direct eye contact unless they were caught off guard. This suggested planning, intention, and experience. This was someone who had done this before. I tried to think rationally about the situation. What should I do? Should I approach him directly and ask what he wanted? Should I report it to campus security? Should I pack up and leave? Part of me worried that I was overreacting, that I would look paranoid or silly if I made a big deal out of what might be a series of coincidences. But another part of me, the part that had been listening to true crime podcasts and reading news stories about campus assaults, was telling me to trust my instincts. I decided to compromise. I would finish my work for the night, but I would stay alert and make note of anything else unusual. If this happened again, I would definitely report it. I spent the rest of the evening hyper-aware of my surroundings, looking up from my work every few minutes to scan the area. I didn't see him again that night, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that he was still there somewhere, just better hidden. When I left the library that night, I made sure to walk out with a group of other students. I checked over my shoulder several times on the way back to my dorm, but I didn't see anyone following me. Still, I felt unsettled and anxious in a way that was completely foreign to me. I had always felt safe on campus, especially in the library. The idea that someone might be targeting me, watching me, learning my patterns, was terrifying in a way that I hadn't expected. Over the weekend, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just stressed from midterms. Maybe I was letting my imagination run wild. Maybe I was watching too many crime shows. By Monday, I had almost talked myself into believing that the whole incident was just a product of academic stress and too much caffeine. But Tuesday night, when I returned to the library, I knew immediately that my instincts had been right. He was there before I even got to the 4th floor. I saw him on the 2nd floor as I was walking toward the elevator, and something about the way he was positioned, the way he seemed to be waiting rather than studying, made my stomach drop. He was wearing different clothes, a gray sweater instead of the navy hoodie, but I recognized his build, his posture, his face. I made a split-second decision to change my routine. Instead of going to the 4th floor, I went to the 3rd floor and found a seat in the literature section, somewhere I had never studied before. I thought maybe if I broke my pattern, if I went somewhere unexpected, I could determine whether he was really targeting me specifically or if this was all in my head. I was wrong. Within 20 minutes of settling into my new spot, I saw him again. This time, he wasn't even pretending to look at books. He was sitting at a table about 50 feet away, facing my direction, with a laptop open in front of him. But he wasn't looking at his screen. He was looking at me. When I stared back at him, challenging him to explain himself, he didn't look away immediately like he had before. Instead, he smiled. That smile was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. It wasn't friendly or embarrassed or apologetic. It was knowing, confident, predatory. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that their prey was finally aware of being hunted and who wasn't concerned about this development. It was the smile of someone who was enjoying the game. I felt my hands start to shake as I reached for my phone. I wanted to call campus security, but I realized I didn't actually know their number. I could call 911, but what would I say? That someone was sitting in a public library smiling at me, that someone had been in the same building as me on multiple occasions. I didn't have any concrete evidence of a crime or even a clear threat. Instead, I decided to leave. I packed up my things as quickly as possible, trying not to look panicked, and headed for the elevator. As I waited for the doors to open, I could feel him watching me. When I got in the elevator and turned around, I saw him standing up from his table, gathering his things. He was planning to follow me. The elevator ride to the ground floor felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure other people could hear it. When the doors opened, I walked quickly toward the exit, not quite running, but moving faster than normal. I could hear footsteps behind me, matching my pace. I didn't dare turn around to confirm it was him, but I was certain it was. As I approached the security desk, I made another split-second decision. I walked directly to the guard, a middle-aged man named Frank, whom I had seen dozens of times over the past few weeks. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think someone has been following me in the library, and I'm concerned about walking back to my dorm alone." Frank looked up from his newspaper with immediate attention. "Following you? What do you mean?" "There's a man, probably in his late 20s, dark hair, gray sweater. He's been watching me study, and he followed me when I moved to a different floor. When I left just now, he got up and started walking behind me." Frank stood up and looked toward the entrance. "I don't see anyone like that now. Did he leave the building?" I turned around and looked toward the door. The man was nowhere to be seen. He was right behind me a minute ago. "Maybe he went back upstairs when he saw me talking to you." Frank nodded seriously. "Let me walk you back to your dorm, and then I'll file a report about this. Can you describe him in more detail?" As we walked across campus, I gave Frank a complete description of the man and explained exactly what had happened over the past week. Frank listened carefully and asked good questions about the timing, the locations, and the man's behavior. He seemed to take my concerns seriously. which was an enormous relief. "You did the right thing coming to me," Frank said as we reached my dorm. "This kind of behavior is never normal, and it's never harmless. We've had issues with non-students gaining access to the library and targeting female students. I'm going to make sure the other security guards know to watch for this guy, and I'm going to recommend that you vary your study schedule for a while." That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. Every shadow outside my window looked like a person. I kept thinking about that smile, about the confidence in his expression when he realized I knew he was watching me. It was the look of someone who had been planning something, someone who had been building up to something, and who wasn't deterred by the knowledge that I was aware of his presence. Wednesday, I tried to study in my dorm room, but I couldn't concentrate. The space felt too small, too isolated, and I kept imagining him somehow finding out where I lived, somehow gaining access to the building. I knew I was being paranoid, but the fear was overwhelming and persistent. Thursday, I made the decision to return to the library, but with a completely different approach. Instead of going alone, I asked my roommate Sarah to come with me. Sarah was a theater major, bubbly and outgoing, and she was happy to bring her own studying to the library for moral support. We went to the second floor this time, to a busy area where there were lots of other students and good visibility from the librarian's desk. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. Sarah and I worked on our respective assignments, chatting quietly occasionally, and I began to relax. Maybe he had been scared off by my conversation with Frank. Maybe he had found a different target. Maybe the increased security presence had discouraged him from coming back. But then Sarah went to the restroom, and within minutes of her leaving, I felt that familiar sensation of being watched. I looked up and saw him on the mezzanine level, looking down at me through the glass railing. He was back to wearing the navy hoodie, and this time he wasn't even pretending to have a legitimate reason for being there. He was just standing there, staring at me, completely motionless. When Sarah returned, I pointed him out to her. "See that guy up there in the blue hoodie? He's been stalking me." Sarah looked up and immediately spotted him. "Oh my God, he's just standing there watching you. That's so creepy. Should we call security?" "Yes," I said, reaching for my phone. I should have called them the moment I saw him. But as I was dialing the security number, Sarah grabbed my arm. "He's moving. He's coming down the stairs." I looked up and saw him walking down the staircase, not hurrying, not trying to hide, just walking deliberately toward our area. There was something about his body language that made my blood run cold. He wasn't nervous or furtive like he had been before. He was confident, purposeful, like someone who had made a decision and was now ready to act on it. "We need to leave now," I said to Sarah, starting to pack up my things. "Should we wait for security?" "No, we need to go now. I don't want to be here when he gets down here." We quickly gathered our belongings and headed for the nearest exit, which was a side door that led to the east side of campus. As we walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, and I could see him following us, maintaining a distance of about 30 feet, but definitely tracking our movement. Once we were outside, Sarah pulled out her phone and called campus security while I called 911. I felt safer in the open air, with other people around, but I was also terrified about what might have happened if I had been alone, if Sarah hadn't been there to witness his behavior and confirm that I wasn't imagining things. 2 campus security officers arrived within 5 minutes, followed shortly by 2 police officers. We gave them a detailed description of the man and explained exactly what had happened. They took our statement seriously and immediately went into the library to look for him. They found him on the 4th floor, in the exact area where I usually studied. He was sitting at a table with books spread out in front of him, but according to the officers, it was clear that he wasn't actually a student. He had no student ID, no legitimate reason for being on campus, and when they questioned him, his story about what he was doing there kept changing. His name was David Morrison, and he was 32 years old, unemployed, and had been living in a nearby apartment complex. When the police searched his belongings, they found a notebook with detailed observations about my study habits, my schedule, and my personal appearance. He had been watching me for much longer than I had realized, probably since the beginning of the semester. The notebook included information about what time I usually arrived, what I usually wore, where I sat, how long I stayed, and which route I took back to my dorm. Most disturbing of all, the notebook included plans for what he called making contact. He had been working up to approaching me directly, and based on the timeline in his notes, he had been planning to do it that very night. If Sarah hadn't been with me, if I had been alone when he came down those stairs, I don't know what would have happened. The police arrested him on charges of stalking and criminal trespass. During the investigation, they discovered that he had been doing this to other female students at Northwestern and at 2 other colleges in the Chicago area. I wasn't his first target, and I wouldn't have been his last. Some of the other victims had been approached directly, and while none had been physically harmed, several had been threatened and intimidated in ways that went far beyond what I had experienced. The legal process was long and emotionally draining. I had to testify about my experiences, relive the fear and anxiety I had felt, and confront the reality of how close I had come to being the victim of something much worse than stalking. David Morrison was ultimately sentenced to 2 years in prison and 5 years of probation, with a restraining order that prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of me or the Northwestern campus. But the legal resolution didn't erase the psychological impact of the experience. For months after the arrest, I struggled with anxiety and paranoia that affected every aspect of my life. I couldn't study alone, couldn't walk across campus after dark, couldn't sit in public spaces without constantly scanning for potential threats. The library, which had been my sanctuary, became a place of fear and traumatic memories. I had to learn new coping strategies, new ways of staying safe while still living my life. I started carrying a personal alarm, learned to trust my instincts about uncomfortable situations, and became much more aware of my surroundings at all times. I also learned the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong, even when you're not sure if you're overreacting. The experience taught me that predators often target people who follow predictable routines, who spend time alone in isolated areas, and who might be reluctant to make a scene or draw attention to themselves. They count on their victims' politeness, their desire to give people the benefit of the doubt, and their fear of seeming paranoid or dramatic. I also learned that campus security and law enforcement take these situations seriously when they're reported properly. My initial hesitation to call for help was based on a fear that I would be dismissed or told I was overreacting. But the reality was that everyone I spoke to understood the seriousness of the situation and responded appropriately. The other victims who came forward during the investigation shared similar stories about ignoring their initial instincts, about trying to rationalize concerning behavior, and about wishing they had reported the incident sooner. Several of them said they had noticed the same man watching them, but had convinced themselves it was coincidence or imagination. One of the most important things I learned from this experience is that feeling uncomfortable or unsafe is not something to be ignored or rationalized away. Our instincts exist for a reason, and they're often picking up on subtle cues that our conscious minds haven't fully processed. The feeling of being watched, the sense that someone's behavior is inappropriate or threatening, the gut reaction that something is wrong. These are all signals that deserve attention and response. I also learned about the importance of having a support system and not trying to handle scary situations alone. If Sarah hadn't been with me that night, if I hadn't had Frank the security guard to turn to, if I hadn't had friends and family to help me through the aftermath, the whole experience would have been much more traumatic and potentially dangerous. Looking back, I can see all the warning signs that I initially dismissed or minimized. The way David Morrison had been watching me was methodical and predatory from the very beginning. The fact that he changed his position when I moved, that he seemed to know my schedule, that he was always positioned where he could observe me without being easily seen, these were all red flags that indicated planning and malicious intent. The smile he gave me when he realized I knew he was watching was particularly chilling in retrospect. That was the moment when he stopped pretending to be a harmless coincidence and started showing his true intentions. It was a moment of intimidation, a way of letting me know that he wasn't afraid of being discovered and that he had no intention of stopping his behavior. The notebook that the police found was probably the most disturbing piece of evidence because it showed just how long he had been watching me and how detailed his observations were. He knew things about my habits that I barely paid attention to myself. He knew which elevator I preferred, which vending machine I used, which bathroom I went to, and even which pen I usually wrote with. This level of detailed observation indicated an obsession that went far beyond casual interest. The fact that he had been targeting multiple students at different schools showed that this was his pattern, his method of operation. He wasn't just some socially awkward guy who had developed an inappropriate crush. He was a predator who had refined his techniques through experience and who was escalating his behavior over time. The police told me that campus predators often start with observation and stalking, then progress to direct contact, then to more aggressive behavior if they're not caught and stopped. The notes in David Morrison's notebook suggested that he was planning to move to the next phase of his pattern, which would have involved approaching me directly and potentially trapping me in a situation where I couldn't easily escape or call for help. This experience fundamentally changed how I think about personal safety and situational awareness. I learned that being polite and giving people the benefit of the doubt are generally good qualities, but they can also be exploited by people with malicious intentions. I learned that it's okay to be rude, to make a scene, to call for help, and to prioritize my safety over social conventions. I also learned about the importance of documenting concerning behavior and reporting it to appropriate authorities. If I had written down the details of each incident when it happened, if I had reported the first few encounters to campus security, the situation might have been resolved sooner and with less trauma. The support I received from the university, from law enforcement, and from my friends and family was crucial to my recovery from this experience. Northwestern implemented new security measures in the library, including increased patrols and better monitoring of who was accessing the building. They also expanded their campus safety education programs to include more information about recognizing and reporting stalking behavior. My therapist helped me understand that the hypervigilance and anxiety I experienced after the incident were normal responses to trauma and that healing would be a gradual process. She taught me techniques for managing anxiety, for distinguishing between reasonable caution and excessive worry, and for reclaiming my sense of safety and autonomy. The other victims and I were able to connect through the legal process, and several of us formed a support group that met regularly during the trial and for months afterward. Sharing our experiences and coping strategies was incredibly helpful, and it reinforced the importance of speaking up about these situations instead of suffering in silence. One of the most powerful realizations I had during this process was that I had done nothing wrong. I hadn't invited this attention, I hadn't been careless or naive, and I didn't deserve to be targeted. Predators choose their victims based on opportunity and perceived vulnerability, not based on anything the victim has done to deserve it. I also realized that my story could be helpful to other students who might find themselves in similar situations. By sharing what happened to me, by describing the warning signs I initially ignored, and by explaining what ultimately helped me stay safe, I hope to help other people recognize and respond to stalking behavior before it escalates. The experience also made me more aware of the broader issue of campus safety and the particular vulnerabilities that students face. College campuses can create a false sense of security because they're familiar environments full of people our own age. But they're also places where strangers can blend in relatively easily and where students often follow predictable routines that can be observed and exploited. I learned that many colleges have resources and support systems in place to help students who are dealing with stalking, harassment, or other safety concerns, but that these resources are only effective if students know about them and feel comfortable using them. Education and awareness are crucial components of campus safety. The legal outcome of my case was satisfying in that David Morrison was held accountable for his actions and prevented from continuing to target other students. But the more important outcome was that I survived a dangerous situation, learned valuable lessons about personal safety, and was able to help other victims find their voices and seek justice. Today, several years later, I still carry some of the caution and awareness that I developed during that experience. I'm more conscious of my surroundings, more willing to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, and more prepared to take action when I feel threatened. But I've also been able to reclaim my sense of safety and autonomy, and I no longer live in constant fear. I've returned to studying in libraries, though I'm more careful about varying my routines and staying in well-populated areas. I've learned to balance reasonable caution with the freedom to live my life fully and without excessive fear. The experience was traumatic, but it was also educational, and it ultimately made me a stronger and more aware person. The most important message I want to share is that if you ever find yourself in a situation where you feel unsafe, threatened, or stalked, trust your instincts and seek help immediately. Don't worry about overreacting or causing a scene. Don't try to handle the situation alone or convince yourself that you're imagining things. Your safety is more important than politeness or social conventions. Document everything, report it to appropriate authorities, and don't let anyone minimize your concerns or convince you that you're being paranoid. Campus security, law enforcement, and other support services are there to help you, and they take these situations seriously when they're reported properly. And remember that you are not alone. Stalking and harassment are unfortunately common experiences, especially for young women on college campuses. There are resources available to help you, other survivors who understand what you're going through, and legal protections that can keep you safe. Your education, your freedom, and your sense of safety are all important, and you shouldn't have to sacrifice any of them because of someone else's inappropriate or criminal behavior. Speak up, seek help, and know that you deserve to feel safe in your own life.